Well, welcome to our study of Augustine, the great Western church father. It is hard to overestimate the importance of Augustine, his influence not just on Western theology, but on the general Western intellectual artifice, Western culture, Western politics, as well as interesting interactions with the Eastern Church and all the rest. Augustine is certainly the most prominent of the Latin or Western church fathers, and he really did sow the seeds of the entire Western theological edifice. Gregory the Great once described his own work as a despicable little trickle, but could speak of the deep torrents of the work of Augustine and Ambrose. And Henry Chadwick is surely right when he speaks of Augustine as the greatest figure of Christian antiquity. So I have 6 talks prepared. The first one will be largely simply biography and setting the scene for Augustine and why he matters and why he is so important. His years are 354 to 430. He is born in North Africa. And he will eventually go to Rome. He will study, have a rather interesting life, and will return to North Africa, where he will become bishop at Hippo and will die in 430 as the Vandals are surrounding the city, and as Augustine is singing and quoting the Psalms as he dies. But this first talk, let us look really just his basic biography, a little bit of who he is and setting him in context. If we think about Augustine as 354 to 431, if you know something about church history, this is a fascinating era. You have the Council of Nicaea in 325, the first of the so-called ecumenical councils, and you have Chalcedon in 451. And Augustine's life is centered right there. You have Constantine will declare that Christianity is now legal. Constantine doesn't make Christianity the official religion of the empire. That comes to Theodosius. But in the early 300s, Constantine declares that Christianity is now legal. And so Augustine is coming into the scene after that decision by Constantine, and now Christianity has begun to become more and more accepted in the empire. And that'll lead to interesting criticisms of Christianity after Alaric and the Visigoths invade Rome in 410. So Augustine's life is full of drama historically. It's in a very interesting time of the Western world. And it is no mystery that since Augustine's time, virtually every thoughtful scholar almost, or many thoughtful scholars have turned to him, whether it's Jacques Derrida in the 20th century, whether it's French existentialists, Albert Camus. It is hard to overestimate how many people have turned to Augustine in different ways as a resource to try to make sense of him. And particularly as evangelicals, I'll be working generally from a book I've written on Augustine, but the last chapter is Augustine and the Protestant. And so Protestants and Catholics have both claimed Augustine and have said he's our guy in different ways. So we'll look at, in our closing lecture, we'll look at how Protestants turn to Augustine for certain things and how we can benefit from Augustine in numerous ways. But we'll also note there's some oddities there's some ways in which Augustine, he really did lay the foundation for much of medieval Roman Catholicism as well. And so the evangelical will benefit very much from a deep study of Augustine, but we also want to be aware that he lays the groundwork for things that traditional Protestants will want to not affirm. And so Augustine is nonstop fun trying to make sense of this fascinating figure. So let's get into who he is and why he matters. Again, his years 354 to 430, and he is today we call a Western theologian, but back in the 4th and 5th century, the divide between East and West was probably not as significant, I suspect, as it has become over time. He was born in the small town of Thagast, Thagsate, in northern Africa, in the present-day Souk Aras, Algeria. Augustine's father, Patricius, does not appear to have been a Christian, but was committed to his son and wanting to provide a good education for him. And we'll talk about Augustine's education in this opening lecture. Augustine's mom, Monica, a confessing Christian, and she looms large in confession. She looms large in Augustine's life. We don't hear as much about his daddy, but his mother is, I'm not sure if this is used here in the UK as much, but in the States we sometimes talk of helicopter parents, parents who hover a bit as their children are getting ready to leave the house. Augustine's mom was very much, in one sense, a helicopter parent, very involved and following Augustine around as a young man, and praying for his conversion. And this is, we won't highlight too much of this in this talk, but he had a very rather debauched sexual life as a young man, and sexual temptation was a big part of his growing up years. I want to say something about Augustine's education. Augustine received what we might call today a classical education. He received a very good traditional education, and as we wrestle with Augustine and wrestle with why he matters, one of the things we'll want to consider is Augustine is both a part of classical antiquity, but as someone like Charles Cochrane has argued in Christianity and Classical Culture, Augustine might be seen also as a shift out of classical antiquity, and indeed might be seen as paving the way for a new way of thinking about church and society and culture more generally, and that Augustine helps lay the groundwork for not being devoted to classical antiquity. So that's something we will try to explore more. But he had what's called a classical education, the trivium of grammar, logic, and dialectic. Excuse me, back up there. He studied the trivium, so the language arts of grammar, logic, dialectic, and rhetoric, so the so-called three ways of the classical liberal arts, and as well as the quadrivium, the four ways of geometry, arithmetic, music, and astronomy. In fact, Augustine set out as a goal to write really how should a Christian think about the seven liberal arts. And we really only have one or two of those works. He never finished that project, and that really is something of a tragedy. It would have been fascinating to see Augustine's mature reflections on the liberal arts. But that's a picture there of Augustine and moving from the effectively non-Christian classical world to the Christian world. Is Augustine was an heir of or was in the tradition of the classical liberal arts, but he also was trying to think about the nature of, particularly language, as a Christian. And that is something which is extremely helpful in today's university world when we're thinking about the nature of language and how language works and whether language is simply about power, etc. So we'll return to Augustine's a bit more in his own education. So Augustine studied in a town, Madouros, Madouros, near Thagaste. And then after a year of idleness in Thagaste, not a great thing for a young man in his 20s, he moved to Carthage for further study. And it is here that Augustine discovered a work by a 1st century BC Roman orator and statesman, Cicero. And Cicero's work, Hortensius, which is not extant, we don't have a copy of that anywhere. And interestingly, this text ignites a love of wisdom in Augustine. This is worth Christians thinking about a bit. He's reading a non-Christian text, but Augustine, who is quite enthralled with his own, with sensual pleasure, sexual pleasure, this ignites something deeper. This ignites something different than simply the sensual. And it's worth reflecting how God can use our experience of a non-Christian text, or maybe not a Christian, a song that's not a hymn, or a song by a non-Christian to ignite our desire for something better than we've experienced thus far. And so that's a part of his story is discovering Cicero, discovering the beauty of wisdom, and beginning to sense maybe there's something more out there. I want to say something about his education. Augustine reflects on his education at length in his book Confessions, his own spiritual autobiography. And so Augustine has this great classical education. So grammar, the study of language, largely Latin grammar, of course. The study of dialectic, which is a kind of back and forth conversation and analysis, and logic is often linked in there with dialectic. And then rhetoric, the art of fitting or persuasive communication. So Augustine is grounded in the so-called 3 liberal arts of the trivium. But Augustine will reflect on his education, and he will say things like, see the exact care with which the sons of men observe the conventions of letters and syllables received from those who talk before them. Yet they neglect the eternal contracts of lasting salvation received from you. So there's this concern, as Augustine reflects on his own education, God will use his training in language, and he will write millions upon millions of words, which we are still reading today. But he will reflect that something was missing in his education. Something was missing. His teachers weren't concerned about his heart or his moral state or his spiritual state. And this is maybe something of what Paul is doing in 1 Corinthians 2 and the Corinthian correspondence in general, when Paul is saying things like, I didn't come to you in high-sounding words, right? Paul is language matters, but the heart matters. And language matters, but the soul matters. Language matters, but whether you know God or not matters. And so Augustine, again, like Paul, will use language and is passionate about communicating well and is passionate about the written word, but also notes, like Paul, we're not to abuse words. We're not to be con men with our language. We're not peddling the word of God. So Augustine will reflect at length in Confessions on the nature of his good classical education, but that in his education it wasn't linked rightly to how do I love God with my mind, and how do I use language in a way that is proper and fitting and consistent with loving and knowing and reflecting the triune God. And so there's plenty of grist for the mill of contemporary Christians that Augustine helps us begin to think about, is how do we think about the nature of language, how do we think about the nature of words, and how do we use language in a way that's fitting and appropriate as Christians. So Augustine will likewise speak of eloquence And eloquence is a good thing, but it should be eloquence in the service of God. So Augustine will reflect in works like On Christian Doctrine, which is really a book not about doctrine in a sense. Some translators now translate it On Christian Teaching. Is how do I, when I go to study the Bible in order to give a sermon, or study the Bible in order to do a Bible study, how do I do that? And so Augustine's walking through how to read the Bible. And one of the things he asks in that book is, should I read non-Christian books? And Augustine says, yes, it's fine to read non-Christian books. And he uses the analogy of the Israelites leaving Exodus. And God says he's going to make the Egyptians favorably disposed towards the Israelites, and you're going to plunder them. So Augustine takes this image of plundering the Egyptians and says, when I read a non-Christian text, one of the things that I do is I try to take that text and I take whatever riches there are in that text and I press those into service, in service to God. And so there's an appropriateness of reading non-Christian texts, but I always have this ultimate end or goal. The Greek word is telos in my teaching. And so I'm using that non-Christian text and pressing it into Christian service. And with rhetoric, for Augustine, language, and we could spend all day just on this. With rhetoric for Augustine, I'm not using rhetoric simply to manipulate someone, unlike some of the rhetors in the city of Corinth that Paul was up against. But rather I use language because God himself is a speaking being, the three persons speaking, communicating to each other, with each other from all eternity. God speaks the world into being. He tells us to speak, to preach, to pray, etc. We worship God with language. So Augustine ends up offering a Christian understanding of language and a Christian rhetoric in a sense. And he does that as well. And on Christian doctrine. Well, let us move on from Augustine and the education. That's a whole other lecture we could do. I want to mention, I've already mentioned one, but let me kind of back up and set the stage a bit. There's really three major, we might say, intellectual turning points in Augustine's life. The first one is his encounter with Cicero and Hortensius and this discovery of wisdom. So think of Cicero and reading Hortensius, the first shift in Augustine's life, or the first, and of course, trying to do someone's intellectual biography is work, but just think in terms of three major turning points. Cicero and reading Hortensius and the discovery of wisdom is the first one. The second one is his dalliance with the Manichaeans. So the Manichaeans are an interesting group. In brief, they're essentially kind of a dualistic sect or a Gnostic sect. So when we say Gnosticism, in shorthand, we're speaking of the notion that we're saved through a secret knowledge, as well as the idea that physical stuff is bad. And so kind of built into the nature of reality is sin or evil or bad. And so Augustine discovered the Manichaeans, and this was also a part of his journey. And it seems like God used it, is he is a fellow traveler for around 9 years with the Manichaeans. Very, very interesting. And this is the notion that the Manichaeans had this mythology of the world. At one point, spirit and matter, good and evil, light and dark, had all been separated from one another. And then when the world came into being, good and evil and spirit matter, light and dark is all kind of mixed up in the world together. And so all of us are like that. Good and evil are mixed up in the heart of who we are. But rather than a Christian notion of redemption, the Manichaeans had the notion that you really had to kind of escape from matter. So there's kind of that Gnostic side of it, getting away from stuff, getting apart from stuff. And if you've seen a movie like National Treasure or The X-Files or something, it almost has that secret mythology built into it. And Augustine is for 9 years, it's a significant chunk of his life, is working in a Manichaean mindset, and eventually meets the present leader of the Manichaeans and begins to ask questions and says, well, I don't buy this at all. And so he becomes quite disenchanted with the Manichaeans and steps away and departs from them. The other great influence besides Cicero and Manichaeism, the significant turning points for Augustine would be his discovery of the books of the Platonists. And in some sense, this will remain with Augustine the rest of his life. There's a major debate in the scholarship to what extent is Augustine a Neoplatonist or not, and we'll do some of that in our course together. But certainly Plato and the so-called Neoplatonists, say 2nd, 3rd century, around 200, so 3rd century, Plotinus and Porphyry, two of the great Neoplatonists, and they offer a kind of a slightly revised version of Platonism. And it also can privilege the spiritual over the physical, but somewhat maybe that might be somewhat counterintuitive. What the Platonists did for Augustine against the Manichaeans is it allowed him to affirm the goodness of creation. We sometimes don't think of Platonism that way, but it's fair to say that for Augustine, Platonism allowed him to at least say the physical world is good, right? There may be a dualism between the physical world and the spiritual, but we might say for Augustine it was a move in the right direction. And so the Platonists were a significant part of his story as well. So Augustine will eventually spend a year in Rome, where he then goes to Milan, where he met Ambrose, the bishop there, and during this year he's teaching rhetoric in Milan, and this is where he's discovering the Platonist. I will linger on his conversion a bit later in the subsequent lecture, but it's in Milan that he has his radical conversion in the Garden of Milan. We'll talk about that. We should mention that Augustine had a long-term mistress. Sometimes an older generation might have used the word concubine. In some, this is passé perhaps now, but in the not too distant future, at least many countries and political entities would have spoken of a common law marriage kind of thing almost. This is a long-term woman with whom Augustine lived. They had one child, Adeodatus, so that's a Latin name, and it's a gift of God or given from God, Deodatus, given from God. Little is known about the mother or Augustine's son. His son dies somewhat young, and he will eventually be separated from this woman. What happens there? Well, the story's worth telling in brief. Monica, enter again Augustine's mother. Monica just didn't think this young girl was quite Augustine's on the right level socially, etc. for Augustine, and basically said, "This isn't happening, son." And so encouraged the separation, which did take place. Monica found another young lady for Augustine, but the young lady was too young, and so there needed to be time for her to grow up. But before the marriage could occur, Augustine had left the scene, and that second marriage, that second relationship with this woman never took place. So the woman that Monica found for Augustine, that marriage would never be consummated. And it is probably fair to say that Augustine's long-term sexual relationship with the first woman marks him in ways that are probably hard to overestimate, and that may show up in some of his later reflections on the nature of the sexual relationship. Now, to begin to bring his biography, and again, it's a potted form of the biography. Augustine will eventually go back to Africa. Now, on the way, he will set up a kind of a monastic community of sorts, where his mom is there and friends are there, and the idea is not quite a theological seminary, but almost a monastic retreat outside Rome, and they will. The idea is that they are gonna study and discuss and read, and some of his early works, Against the Skeptics, The Happy Life, On Order, come out of that time, and this took place at a place called Cassiciacum. It's a small town outside of Milan. Now, Augustine, that community wouldn't be surprising. It doesn't last forever. That's a hard thing. Someone's got to fund, this kind of thing, and so it didn't last forever. And Augustine will eventually head back to Africa, and he goes back to Africa, and Augustine has a wonderful comment where he says, "I was kind of beginning to grow in certain circles and be known, and I really didn't want to get into administration." And so he says, "I'm going to stay away from any church where they might kind of try to suck me into being the leader, being the bishop, being the pastor, etc." But he says, "Well, I'll go to Hippo because they don't know me as well, there." So he goes to Hippo. And the pastor there, the senior, we might say senior pastor, the pastor is getting older, and somehow word gets out that Augustine's there. And by now Augustine's beginning to be known, and so they surround him and basically say, "We think you're to be the pastor." And they surround him. Augustine breaks down in tears. He had not wanted to do this, like people like Calvin and others, and some of the Cappadocian fathers. They just wanted to study and write their books and sip their coffee and enjoy life. But they surround Augustine and say, "You are to be the man." He says, "I wouldn't go near a place where I knew there was no bishop," because he was afraid of being recruited. And so Augustine says this, "I was caught, I was made a priest, and by this grade I eventually came to the episcopate." So he is not forced, but pressured, we might say. Maybe we might say in today's language, he felt a call to do this. And so Augustine is a bishop there from really, kind of assistant pastor for a few years, 4 or 5 years, and then we might say the senior pastor, the bishop, in 395 or 396. And so Augustine then will spend 35 years of his life as a pastor. And this sometimes gets overlooked, that he really did spend 35 years as a busy pastor, engaged in administration, getting some person out of jail, helping a young couple with their marriage. And we should remember that even though now we think of Augustine for great works like the City of God, etc., he really was essentially, for the last 35 years of his life, a busy writing pastor. He will die in 430, again with the Vandals surrounding the city. He will die still battling the Pelagians. We'll return to them in due course. And he will die with the Psalms on his lips. So in closing, the Reformation churches, we do look to Augustine as a hero, and in this course I hope we can see why he matters so much, but also see why there's some oddities or eccentricities that will lead the Protestant to say maybe we shouldn't follow Augustine at every point. But there's a lot to learn from Augustine. I look forward to the rest of our time together.